Well, everyone, thanks for coming. This is the second part of the Adair Turner book lecture. Adair Turner was the head of financial services in England. So he's an establishment figure. He's a guy who would be like a Alan Greenspan, maybe not quite as powerful as Alan Greenspan, but like an SEC head, Trade Commission. And he's also been on many of the appointed committees to study what happened in English finance during this debacle. So he's a real establishment figure. In fact, he's been awarded a lordship in England, Lord Adair Turner. And you know, we come off World War II with the United States as the leading power in the world, with over 50% of the world's output. 1 out of every 2 things made in this world then, 1945, was made here. World War II, 80% of all the energy spent in World War II, 80% of all the gas, oil, and all of that was supplied by the United States for all of World War II, Europe, Japan, and everything. And we probably produced half the output. And the Russians supplied the manpower. The Russians lost 20 million dead. We supplied all of the material stuff for the most part. And at the end of the war, the Russians had half the world, and we had the other half. Okay? So at that time, after being allies in crushing Nazi Germany, we became enemies simply because the economic systems of both countries were antithetical to each other. Capitalism here, socialism, communism there. Now, the United States, after World War II, convenes a council of the victorious powers to set a new monetary standard in the world. The world's fractured, the world's destroyed, the world's wrecked. It convenes in 1946, the Bretton Woods conference. Everybody here knows, I think, or has heard of the Bretton Woods, where instead of the gold standard, which was a difficult system for capitalist countries to use during the Depression, and in that transition, there was a big problem. People going on and off the gold standard. If they needed to print money for war in World War I, they'd go off the gold standard, print the money, try to go back on the gold standard. It wouldn't work, caused all kinds of inflation and problems. So the United States, being the victorious power and the new hegemon, you know what the hegemon is, the United States being the new Rome on the block, has the responsibility to manage the affairs of the capitalists of the Western world. It convenes a conference. The 2 leading powers there are England and the United States. England is a bankrupt, not a defeated country, it's an ally, but it's a bankrupt empire now. They survived because of us. And therefore we had the major say in that conference. The English participant was the most famous economist of the last 100 years, Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. He was the English. And he disagreed with the United States. He said, okay, the United States is setting up a quasi-gold standard. It's saying that the dollar is the gold standard. It'll be the currency that all countries will be measured against, and all countries will fix their currency against the American dollar, and the American dollar will have a quasi-gold content, not total, but quasi. A 25 or 30% gold standard, just to kind of anchor it psychologically in people's heads that it's not a fiat system or a system where you can print money in unlimited amounts. So from 1946 to 1970, about that time, the system was instrumental in rebuilding Western Europe. We introduced the Marshall Plan to lend money to Western Europe, Japan, and we kind of set the capitalist world back in motion, and we were cut off from the communist world led by the Soviet Union. We did reach out to the Soviet Union and ask them at that time if they wanted to be part of Marshall Plan loans and lending. Stalin refused on the theory he didn't want to be integrated in any way to the capitalist system, that he would rebuild within his own empire. Now, his rebuilding job, of course, was much more difficult than the United States. The United States did not have a rebuilding problem. The United States was intact fully after World War II. All its resources there, we never were bombed. You know, we lost a total of 300,000 men out of a population of 160 million people. So not to minimize 300,000 dead, but to put it in perspective, the Soviet Union, with a population at that time of 190 million people, lost 30 million dead. 135 million, 300,000, 190 million, 30 million. And plus in the Soviet Union, 1/3 of their industrial output was completely destroyed. I mean, the Germans had got as far as Stalingrad, which meant the Ukraine, Belarus, and all those were decimated. The Germans applied a scorched earth policy to that. So Stalin had a real job on his hands to rebuild and keep up with us militarily and to support his empire, which was Eastern Europe, and help China. So the United States goes on a tear economically between 1945 and 1970. Those of us who grew up in the heyday of that had no reason to suspect that there would be any real problems, that this system would be more and more productive. Environmental limitations were not in our minds. And that the rest of the world, why couldn't the rest of the world be like America? You know, that's kind of the background. So the United States is managing this Colossus. It has the power in the industrial structure relative to the rest of the world like no other country has ever had. You know, today, then we had 50%. Today, we barely have 30 to 35% of the world, on a much bigger base of the world's production. And most of that is more service manufacturing, a lighter manufacturing than the whole gamut of manufacturing that we had back then. Those old manufacturing jobs companies supplied lots of jobs for middle and working class Americans. The United States had a problem of managing this over a long period of time. It had a Roman problem of a different sort. It's got a competitor, communism, that intellectuals in the United States looked highly on. They said, look, whatever communism is, the people were working during the Depression. They did not see the Stalinist aspect of repression that Stalin felt he had to employ, because there was always revisionist tendencies of the Soviet Union to come back to capitalism. So he implied a harsh and brutal regime. There's no question about that. So the net effect is, we saw them as an enemy. The left in this country saw them as the path that we would go in the future. So our reactionary business people, after coming out of the beating in the Depression and having to take Roosevelt reforms, started to come back to the fore and started to unravel Roosevelt legislation. The first thing they did was they didn't allow the Full Employment Act of 1946 to be passed. That was an act that would have guaranteed all Americans to have a job, no matter what, that the government would be the last resort employer. That was not passed. And of course, the capitalist class of that time would have said, if you allow full employment and government coming in and swooping up all the unemployment, we lose the discipline of the working class. We can't make them work hard and make the profits that we want to make, simply because I'm working for an employer and I don't like what I'm seeing. I quit, I can get a guaranteed job, so why would I bust my ass, right? So they didn't want that, and they prevented these things from occurring. And also during this period, the United States has to have bulwarks against communism. They have to have allies. And who are the major allies that they figure they can use to fight against communism. Well, they wanted to have China in Asia as the bulwark against communism, but it so happens that the Chinese had a communist revolution. So we lost China, and I won't go into the details of what happened there. So the United States shifted its emphasis as an ally on our former enemy, Japan. Japan was a classic industrial powerhouse on the make, a mortal enemy of the United States, now totally defeated, humiliated, nuclear weaponed. They now are a loyal ally because they have no choice. And on the other side, who do we bring back? Germany. All right, so we have to take our former enemies and we have to build them up. And this is kind of the beginning of our narrative now to get to the Turner book. So now we have to build up these allies. And to build up these allies with the Marshall Plan, we have to sell them capital equipment. And we have to lend them the money for working capital so they can get started. And then we have to supply them a market within which to sell these products. Think about it, all right? Two former enemies who are very powerful enemies to us. I mean, it took us and the Soviet Union essentially a lot of time, treasure, and manpower to subdue these people. It took essentially 40 million dead people to an American production of enormous amounts. I mean, essentially almost half of the GNP of America at the time was devoted to war production. And we simply overwhelmed them. But it took 5 years. We had to kill 12 or 14 million of them. And you've seen all the old newsreels, right? You've seen the History Channel. You've seen now there are allies against the Soviet Union. But they also now have brand new equipment. We're selling them the best equipment. The United States is not re-equipping itself. It's got its existing plant and equipment, and they'll change that as it goes. But these other people have new equipment. They're working for dirt cheap wages relative to the United States. And they have to be allowed to sell their products within the United States because there's no other market with purchasing power. So right there is the beginning of our problem. We could pick up the mortgage problem, we could pick up Adair's problem and all the other things, but right there, the seeds of the problem are sown. And that starts to occur on the build-up probably by 1960. They're back in business, and now they have to learn how to make products to compete in the American market, which has big advantages. So by the time they learned that, it took into the 1970s for that to occur. So now Americans said, okay, we will allow this. We need a bulwark against the Russians. No matter how good the Germans and Japanese get, they can never compete with us. We're Americans. We have a history of always winning, always having success. The Japanese were beaten. The Germans were beaten. When were we ever beaten? We were never beaten in any major wars. I mean, up till that time, we have a 200-year history of an open frontier where people, if they were oppressed, could simply move west, start over again. Not that it was easy or as easy as I'm making it sound, but there was a safety valve, an open frontier, that allowed America to have a 200-year winning history. No one ever invaded America. So Americans are inviolate mentally in terms of who can compete against us. Japanese, Germans, we beat them. We've got the highest standard of living in the world. How can we possibly end up like we are today, relatively speaking? The United States is a free enterprise country. It's organically growing. It took time out in the military to use its productive capability to build weapons of war. Then it comes back and builds consumer products. But Germany and Japan are also doing that. But Germany and Japan are doing it in a different way. They're doing it with new equipment. They're doing it with cheaper labor. and they're also ferociously protecting and we allowed that, protecting imports to come into their country. Exports can go out of their country. Imports, so we can't even get into their countries to compete, but what's okay. We still got plenty of markets. We got Asia, we got Latin America, we got our own high consumer market of high earners that we can do this. But meanwhile, the Japanese sit home. They set up industries. Unlike America, they did not allow random, and this is a good point to remember in this lecture about, on Turner's lecture, the Japanese did not allow growth to occur under these conditions randomly. The Japanese government, the Japanese Treasury Department, deliberately allocated credit, created money and credit that only went to industries that they felt long-term they'd have a competitive export advantage. They didn't go for any silly products. They didn't go for consumer products that necessarily make the Japanese happy. They went for products that they knew would have a big market overseas, and to make sure they could get those markets, they gave credit to these companies, which in effect allowed them not to fail, and then they made them compete against each other in Japan. Like 5 auto companies in Japan competed against each other, and if they lost, the Japanese government would put the people into other industries. It wouldn't allow them to fail, but the winners of this contest on products, whether it be electronics or autos, then started exporting to the United States. And the lesson is clear even to today. Quality and all that is unbelievable, right? Who are these people that can create that? So they started eating into American markets with better products, right? Germans and Japan. And during that time in the 60s, especially the time of Vietnam War, we have the obligation to do the fighting in this system. We're the empire. If the Russians are trying to encroach anywhere in Europe or in Asia, South America, Fidel Castro, we have the burden of defense. We have to do the fighting. And we start taking our working class people off the production lines and put them in the military, sending them to Vietnam. And for those of you who can remember the Vietnam era, it was a time of real strife and troubles because American people, American workers, American kids didn't want to do that. They're living okay, they have a good future. Why should they want to, for $55 a month, go into the jungles and everything else and kill communists, when they're not the guys making the big bucks? And there's a whole, and the Black Revolution occurs at the same time. So everyone feels entitled in America because we have such a high standard of living. Already the dynamic to knock that standard of living down is occurring with the exports coming in. And the establishment in America sees tumult and unrest in the working class. They want more, they want to work less, they want their rights, they want individual freedom, and pretty soon, between our defense commitments, our subsidizing everybody, and our hemorrhaging of money, we can't maintain the monetary standard of Bretton Woods anymore. Everyone starts seeing our weakness. The French start asking for any American dollars that they have, that they got from exports, to be redeemed in gold. So they start eating into our gold stock here. So if you remember, Nixon shut the gold window. He basically said, we haven't got the gold to do this. I wish he didn't do it. De Gaulle was the instigator, the French nationalist, Charles de Gaulle. He cuts off the American dollar from a gold backing because he can't pay it. Now here we have the setup. We have competitors who are ferocious, hungry, with cheaper labor forces. These labor forces are not rebellious. Okay, we're in the 1970s, just turning into the 70s. We have an entitled labor force, high paid, wanting more, everyone wanting their rights, everyone figuring that they can be part of the bounty. And the American banking and ruling class get exasperated. This is not going to work. And the Reagan Revolution comes as a reaction to this, culminates in Reagan, basically coming and say, the government is not going to give you any more handouts. This is a different world. Labor should know its place. They fire their traffic controllers, signaling the end of labor support, and of course, it's starting the assault on unions. Now, so we're kind of up to where the game really begins as we see it now. But go back at that time, no one had any idea that things would unravel so fast with working and middle class Americans. Now, when I say unravel so fast, the unraveling is we have the highest standard of living, we're growing every year, we can support a family with one earner and all that. It's not like the United States is, the whole country is poverty stricken now. You know, it's all relative, you know. I mean, you could argue it's not so bad even today, right? You can even argue that everyone who's alive today is doing okay if they're simply alive, even if it's Bangladesh or Haiti. I mean, if you want to look at it that way. But the United States mindset was onward and upward here. And now that's taken away. Okay, but the American establishment has to go to the voters. High technology, thin employment businesses. Take a look at Google, you take a look at Facebook, for example. High value, very few employees. And those employees are all very talented people. The general population can't get into Google. You can't get into Microsoft. What's his name? Bill Gates tells you, and you can look him up on the internet, he only hires high IQ people. You go and you can't pass his test, you don't get hired. Now you can argue whether it's a valid test or not, but Bill Gates thinks it's viable. He hires that way, so these exclusions become built into the system. A 10% world, international, that's doing quite well. New York is doing quite well relative to the rest of the country. Wouldn't you agree? If you're living in Manhattan and you're part of this thing, what is your problem? Go 50 to 100 miles outside here and ask those people upstate New York what their problem is. Just a little digression. The United States was not built on free trade. Does everyone know that? I mean, the United States, after Alexander Hamilton wrote his report on manufacturing to the Congress in 1801, he basically said, yes, the English are telling us about free trade. The English say, you know, you do what you do best, a la David Ricardo, and they'll do what they do best. Well, of course, what they do best is they had a head start on machinery, which is very productive, and we were farmers, and pretty productive. So they basically said, why don't you just stay as farmers, and we'll stay as manufacturers, and we'll buy your farm products, and you buy our machinery. Well, Alexander Hamilton said yes. At any one point in time, it makes sense. But if you look at the world in a dynamic way, 5, 6, 10, 20 years, if you stay farming, and on the other hand, you stay manufacturing, your technology will increase a lot faster here than your farming technology. In fact, your farming technology will be a function of your manufacturing technology. So he said, look, we understand why the English want free trade. They rule the world with it. But we have a continental landmass 40 times bigger than England. And if we do what they do, we're the same people, essentially. We're cousins. We've gone over and we've stolen their machine designs. We've sent people over. We know what to do. We'll do it here. We'll keep theirs out. We'll put tariffs 30 or 40%. Maybe we'll pay a little more because of that in the short run. But in the long run, he said, we will outdo England and be #1 manufacturing country in the world. And 80 years later, we were 40% tariff duties. So, of course, once you become the leader, then you want free trade for everyone else, meaning You'll sell your products for example, into Africa because they can't compete with you now. And then you can make a bad deal and get their resources cheap because you have the high ground of all the technology. And you can maintain that position. Now with free trade, once nobody else can match you on productivity. But if you look at America on the other side, within its borders, it was a free trade country within its own borders. That was an excluded competition from without coming in. But within its borders, since the wages were the same, the knowledge was the same, the capital was the same, the education was the same, competition there enhanced the mechanisms that we in effect created and copied from England, and we created bigger markets, we competed harder, we had more, with a bigger market, we could have lower unit costs. So it all worked virtually for us as long as we had free trade with equals. But free trade with unequals is death. And of course, free trade with us in Latin America, Africa, and the poor parts of Asia, rightly, basically puts them in a position of inferiority that they can't come back from. You take Africa, for hundreds of years, they were not allowed to develop. You know, they couldn't have anything. They have to take free trade, which means that anything they need, they have to get from us. We would not allow their indigenous industries to grow. We wouldn't let them put up tariffs. Wherever the countries became independent enough to do that, we knocked them right down. Because we knew how the game works. So these countries can never develop, you know, unless they put up tariffs. Now, the fair way of doing that for us, once we had a high standard of living, which we did in the 1970s, we should not have allowed unrestricted free trade, because unrestricted free trade then basically says you give away the wages of our people, you give away the infrastructure that those wages bought. They bought unions, they bought real estate, they bought houses, they bought schools, they bought universities. All that took money to support. If you take that away, the wages, out of those wages, all that support drops, and we have to borrow money to fake it for a while. So we could have sealed that off. We could have had free trade in selected industries by agreement, industries that have, you know, economies of scale in a really global, like aircraft. A few key industries you could have shared with the rest of the world, but the bread and butter industries, you should have protected your wages and helped other people start from a base and not be flooded with your products and build them up the same way. They would have a lower standard of living, but you can keep yours and you can bring them up. With the proviso, of course, you can't bring everybody up to our standard of living without pillaging the planet. To bring everyone to our standard of living on this planet would take 4 times the resources that we're currently using. If they say it will take only 2 times those resources to totally wreck the planet. So we're caught in a very difficult situation. You can't equalize anything without wrecking the planet, and if you don't equalize it, you're going to have revolution. You know? When communism fell, as he alluded to, there was a great belief in capitalism, that capitalism was the most efficient system of all, and that the market could make all the decisions for you because the market would make it right, and government planning would somehow muddy it up. This became the conservative Milton Friedman philosophy, the Reagan philosophy, where if you could get government out of the way, things would really boom. The United States was suffering not because it outsourced and all that, it's because it had too much government. Reagan said, get government off our backs. All right, so by doing that, they were relying on an economic theory that said, markets know best. If you just create a market in anything, the most efficient outcome will occur. Now, they all believe. Now, some smart people didn't believe it, but it was convenient that Greenspan and a lot of other people actually believed it because they could say, hey, what do you want from me? This is the most efficient way. You feel pain now, but down the road, you third world countries or you American workers, down the road, 100 and 200 years from now, we'll all be one country and one standard of living, and that may very well be true if you can get to that point without killing everybody. Okay? So they kick it way down saying efficient markets without government interference are the best way to go. Now we know any reasonable study of history You can't have markets without regulation. You'd have free-for-alls. It's simply not true. But this was a very powerful, and still is powerful today. Listen to the Republicans. You listen to Cruz. Yeah, we want free enterprise. We don't want government interfering. We don't want government bureaucrats, all that. Meanwhile, half the GNP is government control, because if it wasn't, this country would really collapse. Your Social Security, your military, your health care, all of that is basically socialist. So everyone's kidding themselves if they think this is a true capitalist country. Better than 50% of the output of this country is socialist already.